Let's talk about the many things that affect our mental health. So unresolved childhood trauma has a way of bubbling up whenever we're under severe stress or something like that. Gut health, now they know, is that 90% of our serotonin actually comes from our gut health. So not having a healthy gut microbiome can hugely affect our mental health. That having some sort of physical activity has a greater impact on depression than medication overall. It can be family thinking systems or family coping systems that can be passed on that can affect our mental health. But it's least affected by genetics, which is very interesting. As you can see, mental health challenges, it's not a clear-cut box. It's more of a sliding scale, but it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to be our identity. We all have challenges, we all have struggles, and we're not alone. And we can keep getting better and better. Have you ever been diagnosed with a mental illness? Or have you had some mental health challenges? You're not alone. I have. I was diagnosed at 28 with bipolar. And most of us in our lifetime will struggle with some sort of mental health issue. So let's talk about it. It's really hard because there's potential of shame and frustration wrapped around mental illness, which doesn't need to be there. And I think it's improving so much, and I'm very grateful for that. And I want to just share what I have learned from just my own experience. First of all, as a precursor note, this is not an episode to say get off medication. There should be no shame in being on medication and the benefits it's having for you. So please don't get that from this episode and just have gratitude for the medication. And so let's talk about the many things that affect our mental health. So in Western society, we have a very black and white boxed approach to mental illness. And basically, psychiatrists use the DSM-5 to diagnose a mental illness based on symptoms. There's a couple challenges with that. First of all, it's based on just the symptoms. It doesn't take into account what we're going to be talking about today, and that's the many different things that affect our mental health. And second of all, I think that's really challenging is when you have that stamp of, hey, you got diagnosed as bipolar, it kind of follows you all of your life, which is very strange because it doesn't need to be that way. Strep isn't like that. Other things aren't like that. And it doesn't have to be something that will affect our whole entire lives. So it's something to just be aware of that as well. So what are the things that affect our mental health that a lot of psychiatrists and doctors don't take into account? And I will say a precursor that there is a lot more expansion in this area, and we'll talk about a lot of different doctors and resources that are more holistic, but in general, they don't take into account these 11 things. So let's talk about it. First of all, they don't take into account the effects of past trauma. So unresolved childhood trauma has a way of bubbling up whenever we're under severe stress or something like that. So I really say it's such a preventative thing when we are brave enough to deal with our past traumas and our past experience and work through those and gain a peace and a clarity on that. So I would say the first thing that affects our mental health is our past traumas. The second thing, and this is a biggie, is the effect of our current circumstances. And I would say stress is huge. And this is something that really played a part into my own challenges when I was 28, as I was under a huge amount of stress in the sense that I had just had a baby with all the responsibilities on me, and the marriage was not healthy for me at all. And so it was very, very stressful, and I found out I was kind of just in fight or flight all the time. That sort of stress is going to bring out mental health challenges. And so that's very important to look at the stress that we're under or what we're currently going through. The third is physical challenges can really affect our mental health. It could be something as an illness, a virus. They've actually found now that there's a connection between viruses and even some schizophrenia and some mental illnesses that before they thought there was no connection on that. Lyme's disease, life changes can have some physical challenge. Like for me, when I was 28, I had a baby at 27 and was still recovering from that. So that was a big physical challenge. So physical challenges definitely have a way of affecting our mental health. The fourth is the effect of nutrition. And this is very interesting because gut health, now they know, is that 90% of our serotonin actually comes from our gut health. So not having a healthy gut microbiome can hugely affect our mental health. And that's a big, huge connection. So for example, I read this example in a book recently, how a long-term schizophrenic actually really responded to a keto diet. And it was just amazing. Whereas a lot of people used to say, once you have schizophrenia, you always have it. And they're finding that that's actually not always the case. And we've got to kind of expand our view of all of that. Also, a depletion of nutrients. Certain nutrient depletion can definitely trigger mental health challenges. Or even like a toxic amount of something like mold or different things will affect our mental health. So that's huge. The interesting thing is, right before my mental challenges got really bad when I was 28, I had just taken an antibiotic, and I could tell a kind of almost a switch difference. Because before I was really challenged, and then after I took that antibiotic, it was a very drastic difference for me. So that's very interesting that now they know the connection with gut health. The fifth one is physical activity. So it's interesting that they now know that having some sort of physical activity has a greater impact on depression than medication overall. And, but it's so hard when you are depressed to be physically active. I remember, because there was, times that I had depression with the bipolar, and I remember like a 2-minute walk every day, making myself do that was so much work. It was very challenging, but just doing that physical activity was just the start of that climb back up out of my mental health challenge. So definitely physical activity. 6, which is interesting, is it's least affected by genetics, which I think there's been like this a lot of correlation with genetics, but it's very interesting when we talk about like family systems, because there can be family thinking systems or family coping systems that can be passed on that can affect our mental health, but it's least affected by genetics, which is very interesting. So a big thing, and I would say this is number 7, and this is not in any specific order, by the way, is mind management. This is huge. Being how to manage our mind and training our mind, it's like a muscle, and being able to like train it with the thoughts and have process our thoughts and process our feelings is huge. For me, during my time, I would have thoughts and I would push them aside because I'm like, I cannot think about that I'm not liking my marriage. That is like a terrible thing. Things like that. And I would not allow myself to process, these feelings and thoughts that I was having. So my mind management was really, a struggle during that time. So that's number 7. 8 is habits. Our habits affect us hugely. When I talk about our habits, I'm talking about our physical habits, our mind habits, our different habits. And so healthy habits affect us in a great way as far as mentally, whereas unhealthy habits like, alcohol and, lots of alcohol, staying out late, can have just the opposite effect. So our habits affect our mental health a lot. And so that's one reason why I have to create, very healthy mental habits just as a protection for myself. So number 9, as far as our mental health, is our social support. To be seen, heard, and valued is a need of all of ours. To be loved and to love and be loved is essential. And when we don't have that, that can be really challenging. And we see that a lot in domestic abuse situations, because a number of times the abuser will try to isolate the situation, because then they're lacking that social support, and that's really important. And really, social support is not just hanging out with people. It's people that you can be real with, like, hey, I'm actually really struggling, and this is what I'm going through. And also having support with a mental health team, I think, is essential. I always have like a good counselor on call, a good doctor on call, a psychiatrist if needed. Just having a support system for our overall health is really essential. And of course, my naturopath is like number 1 in there. So that's the 9th thing, is social support. The 10th thing is our brain health. And this is what's so interesting. Dr. Amen has done a lot on this, because he's done a lot of brain scans, and he's a psychiatrist that is a very holistic psychiatrist now. But he always thought it was very interesting that everyone else, like, cardiologists, they look at the heart, and every other doctor looks at the organ, but with psychiatry, they didn't look at the brain. So he started doing SPECT imaging of the brain, which is so fascinating because he can actually see mental health problems within the brain. He can see areas where they're just lacking circulation or areas where it's too stimulated and how that affects our mental health. So that's very fascinating, is our brain health. So I always think about, like, as far as my nutrition and everything, I'm always thinking about, like, I'm eating for my brain. I'm not always, it's great to have treats and stuff, but I'm really focusing on, like, eating for my brain health. Brain injuries can have a big impact on mental health. And so it's nice because there are ways to help recover in those brain injuries. And so it's definitely worth studying that, getting some help on that. And then the 11th thing that affects our mental health is our soul health and caring for our soul. And that's our spiritual connection with God, universe, but knowing that we have a soul, that we have a God who loves us and thinks we're amazing, and really connecting with that soul part of us. I'll tell you, in my previous marriage, my soul was dying because I was constantly in an environment where I was constantly being ignored for not cooperating with his demands. And my soul was just dying in that situation. My soul health was not good. And so soul health is, I think, something we really need to consider. And it's going to be great because we have a guest coming on from Finding Freedom, and she's going to talk about soul health. So look for those episodes, and that's very interesting. Are you a chronic people pleaser? Do you overgive, overfunction, pretty kind, and you're just tired, or maybe even a little bit resentful? Or are you wondering, like, wow, is this all to life? Is this how it works? Because I kind of feel like I'm going through the motions. Well, that's what the Unravel Notebook is for. It's 61 days to unravel our thinking, beliefs, and live a life intentionally as we connect closer with God, ourselves, and others, so we can be more confident and live brighter in this world. So as you can see, mental health challenges, it's not a clear-cut box. It's more of a sliding scale, and sometimes they just miss the boat. Psychiatrists and doctors can just miss the boat because they're not taking in all of that in. And so it's just important to remember that when a psychiatrist looks at it, they're looking at the DSM-5 and it's diagnosis over the symptoms. And unfortunately, that can follow us, but it doesn't need to. It doesn't need to be our identity. We all have challenges, we all have struggles, and we're not alone. And we can keep getting better and better. So it's very interesting, like, even though, antidepressants and different things, a lot of times we're finding that they're not as effective, and some of the consequences of them are not so good. And so again, looking at this overall mental health picture is very important. And really, we have to understand that doctors are really doing the best they can, and how important we need to advocate for ourselves and really look for a holistic approach and take healthy steps and have that support system. I think the hard part is, like, when we're going through a mental health challenge, it's hard to advocate for ourselves. It's hard to understand because our brain isn't working right, our bodies aren't working right. It's hard. And that's why I always think it's really important to have people in your life beforehand, have a good counselor set up, have a good doctor that you know and trust and have that relationship with, have a life coach, have those tools in place. Because like I said, we all struggle at different times, and having that social system of not only friends and family that are healthy for you, but that medical system is great. When I was 28, I didn't have a doctor, I didn't have I didn't have anyone, I didn't have a counselor, and then all of a sudden this was on me, and I was in a destructive relationship, and it was very difficult to advocate for myself. It was very hard. And so, as you heard from my story, I basically went back to the same situation in order to, for my own reasons, and I've talked about that too. For my story, I was in an abusive relationship. I had undiagnosed Hashimoto's. So I had hyperthyroidism, and that actually didn't get diagnosed for 8 years later when they thought I had thyroid cancer, took out my thyroid, and realized they never did a Hashimoto's test, and now I don't have a thyroid. But at 28, I had just had a baby, and I had just taken an antibiotic. And, it was nice having medication at first when I was diagnosed with bipolar, because what that medication did was lower my metabolism, which means that it actually helped my hyperthyroidism, which was fabulous. long term, it didn't serve me, that particular medication, because it allowed me, and this medication is actually known for this, but it allowed me to stay in an abusive situation because it's more like surviving, and it kind of numbs you a little bit. It was interesting though, because the doctors were the first ones that actually got me off medication after I'd been on it for a while. And I thought that was super strange, because the largest problem with bipolar diagnosis and then getting off medication is when people, it's known that, you know, a lot of people with bipolar, they'll feel good and they'll get off their medication, and then it's just not a good scenario. And so I was very hesitant to ever consider that. So it was very interesting when the doctors actually got me off, and you know, all of that. And then I did great for 5 years, but then I had another, you know, really abusive episode about 5 years, and so ended up getting back on medication after that destructive cycle. But that, at that point, I realized, gosh, I really got to look at this, you know, more holistically, and look at like my mental health, how my soul is doing, and just all of that. And so I chose to start, you know, taking care of myself in those ways. So I created a healthy lifestyle, and then I was with the doctor that after I created a healthy lifestyle and got a divorce because my partner didn't want to work through the things, is then I got off medication, and I've been off for about 7 years. And the reason why in my case I chose to get off is because of the side effects long term were not good on this medication. Also, I really questioned the validity of the diagnosis, because I felt like either I was misdiagnosed or I have mild bipolar, and I have no idea if I have either. The most important thing is how I look at it is I had mental challenges and I could have them again. And the one thing I've noticed that affects my mental health is my primary relationship. So I'm very thankful that I have a husband now that, you know, the biggest thing is like healthy conflict resolution and love and respect, which were both, all of those were missing in my previous marriage. And so having that healthy lifestyle is just a protectant for me. And I also keep a healthy lifestyle in general. I'm not opposed to medication. Like if I ever had like a really stressful situation or something that happened, you know, I'd be like, yeah, I am very thankful for it and I'm happy to get on it. So I definitely don't have a problem with medication. And I can definitely relate to mental challenges. I can relate to depression because there was a time where life was very black and white. Like that depressed time after I had the baby just became very black and white. And then after I came back from the mental hospital, just very depleted and very black and white. And that just feels so terrible. So if you've ever experienced that, it's just a terrible feeling, and I'm so sorry for you. And it doesn't have to be permanent. It can be temporary. You know, I've also experienced mania. You know, that fight or flight for chronic time, you know, being in a situation, walking on eggshells and abuse is just horrible. And so definitely I can relate to mania too, where your brain is going da 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 da, and then you're not thinking well. And it's horrible when you know you're not thinking well, and you know, it's just a horrible thing when you feel like your mind and your body are rebelling against you. But I actually rebelled against my body first by not listening to my soul, not listening to my physical health, having poor boundaries, things like that. Can relate to being delusional, especially when they OD'd me on medication one time. I'm like, wow, that was very interesting. So let's talk about how mental health has changed over the years, because that was when I was 27 and 28. And they've come a long ways, which I'm so thankful for. So I really encourage, if this interests you, to look into resources like The End of Mental Illness by Dr. Amen. And that's a fascinating book. Also look for him on YouTube. He's got several facilities and he's a holistic psychiatrist. Another great book is The Body Keeps the Score. That was very fascinating when it talks about how trauma affects us. It's a kind of a deep read, but very fascinating as far as that. A newer book, The Anatomy of Anxiety by Ellen Vora, is very fascinating when we talk about anxiety. And then Dr. Laura Leaf, she's a neuroscientist, and she specializes on like training the brain and different things like that. And she actually has an app to help with mind management, and she's fabulous. And I always say, if you're on medication, stay on medication, seek a holistic approach and healthy steps. If you want to consider getting off medication, please, please, please work with a doctor, because it really needs to be like a 1-year monitored, slow approach. The biggest challenge when people get off medication is like, gosh, if they do it themselves, it's suddenly, that's very destructive, very bad on our bodies. But also, like, the amount of slow weaning that needs to be done is so important, because a huge amount of symptoms, people think, oh gosh, I'm having my symptoms again, are actually withdrawal symptoms. And so it's very important to have a doctor that does it so slowly and does it over a year, because that's huge. So that's important. So I just want to talk to people that if you've had a mental health challenge, you're not alone. And most of us will have challenges, and it's okay to talk about it. It's our part of us. It's okay. And if you know somebody that's having mental health challenges, I hope this gives you a little bit of understanding and compassion, and a little bit of, some tools as well. So I want to end with an exercise, and this is just an exercise to help process through all of this. And so let's go ahead and get started. So take a deep breath in, and then breathe out slowly through your mouth. Take a big deep breath in through your nose and hold it, and breathe out through your mouth slowly. I want you to keep doing that and just listen to my words. And say this to yourself. I choose to accept myself. I will not use my past against me. God, universe, help me to find the tools that I need that will serve me. Bring the lessons and messages from my past that serve me now. Help me to gain new understanding into a situation where I feel like I need more understanding. I will seek guidance from God, self, others, or however it comes. Make it a great day and grow 1% at a time. Stay tuned for our next episode.